You have no right to be here. Get out of my seat right now.
This is my seat. I have the boarding pass.
Let's just solve this peacefully, please. I said, don't touch me again. Don't you dare touch me again.
Calm down, sir. Calm down.
Please stop it.
You knew exactly what you were doing. How could you? Calm down, please. Don't tell me to calm down. You're gonna pay for this. You think you're above the law? You'll pay for this.
Oh, stay out of my face.
Please, stop. You think you can talk to me like that? Back away from him now. Let go of me. Get off. You're under arrest. Come with us.
You people do not belong up here. Those words came out of a flight attendant's mouth before the aircraft door was even sealed, and by the time the night was over, an airline would learn exactly what it costs to say something like that to the wrong two people. The gate agent tore their boarding passes clean in half. Didn't hand them back. Just let the pieces fall onto the counter like garbage nobody wanted to claim. That was the moment Elijah Turner understood what kind of night this was going to be. Not from the ripped paper, not from the little smirk the man behind the counter tried and failed to hide. It was the way his wife went still beside him. Completely still. The particular stillness Naomi wore when she was deciding whether a situation deserved her energy yet. And Naomi Turner never wasted her energy on anything that didn't deserve it. She reached down, picked up both halves of her boarding pass, pressed them back together like a woman inspecting a broken bone, and looked the gate agent dead in the eye, without blinking once. "I'll need those reprinted," she said. Her voice was quiet. That specific quiet. Elijah had spent 18 years married to this woman, and he knew that tone the way a sailor knows a change in weather before the sky admits it. It was the same voice she used in a hospital conference room when some overconfident young resident had made an error, so serious that nobody else in the room had noticed it yet, except her. The agent reprinted the passes without another word. That had been 45 minutes ago, in the main terminal of a Texas airport busy with the low roar of a Friday evening. Now Elijah walked beside Naomi through the priority corridor toward gate C-22, her rolling suitcase in one hand, her fingers laced through his in the other. The air around them carried that particular hum only airports have, boarding calls bouncing off polished floors, the hiss of automatic doors, the endless thunder of wheels dragging luggage across tile. Elijah knew this hum better than almost anyone alive. 22 years with the Federal Aviation Administration had put him in more airports than most people spend afternoons in their own backyard. He could read this building the way a surgeon reads a chart. But tonight, he reminded himself, he wasn't here to inspect anything. Tonight, he was just a man taking his wife to Rome for their 18th anniversary. Naomi glanced up at the departure board, her dark skin catching the cool overhead light, her expression softening the way it always did right before a trip. "Rome," she said, almost to herself. 16 days of absolutely nothing. That resembles a hospital pager. You say that every trip, and I mean it every single time. She laughed, and the sound of it cut straight through the noise of the terminal, the laugh she saved only for him, the one that came from somewhere she kept locked away from the rest of the world. Elijah held that sound in his chest like something he didn't want to let go of. 18 years. They had built an entire life on late nights, missed dinners, and the slow, relentless labor of making American skies safer for everyone who ever stepped onto a plane. Elijah had climbed from field inspector to senior air carrier safety investigator, one of a small number of federal officials with the authority to ground an airline's entire fleet, audit its operations from top to bottom, and issue fines that could run into the tens of millions of dollars. In certain conference rooms, in certain boardrooms, his word carried the weight of federal law. Naomi had climbed a different mountain to reach the same summit. A PhD in aerospace human factors, a medical degree. She was the woman half the major airlines in the country called when they needed to understand how fatigue, bias, and the slow erosion of routine judgment could turn a competent pilot into a dangerous one without anyone noticing until it was too late. Training manuals in cockpits across the country carried her research, whether the pilots reading them knew her name or not. They had earned this trip in every sense a person can earn something. The priority lane was nearly empty. A young gate agent scanned their boarding passes with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. and Dr. Turner," he said, not even looking up. The jet bridge air was cooler than the terminal, and they stepped aboard the wide-body aircraft into the hushed luxury of first class. Deep charcoal leather pod seats, private lighting, the kind of cabin that told you, without a single word, that you had arrived and you belonged exactly where you were standing. A flight attendant stood at the cabin entrance, running through the practiced choreography of a boarding smile. Blonde hair pulled back severely, mid-40s, a brass name tag that read Patricia Reese. "Welcome aboard," she said. The smile was correct. Her eyes were not. Elijah caught it immediately, not a flicker of open hostility, nothing dramatic, just the smallest pause, a fraction of a second, where her gaze moved across the two of them, and something behind her eyes quietly recalculated. It wasn't the practiced sweep of a woman doing her job. It was the assessment of someone staring at an equation that refused to balance. "Good evening," Elijah said. "Seats 1A and 1B. He held out their boarding passes. Patricia took them. Read them a second time. Then looked back up at Elijah with a smile that had thinned at the edges, almost imperceptibly. "Right this way," she said. The pods were everything the fare had promised. Wide, private, a surface smooth enough to rest a champagne flute on, without a second thought. Elijah lifted their carry-ons into the overhead bin and settled in. Naomi was already studying the entertainment touchscreen, with the calm, focused curiosity she brought to every new environment, the same way she studied an unfamiliar chart in a hospital. Elijah was watching Patricia Reese. She had drifted toward the forward galley and was speaking to someone out of his sight line, her body angled away, her voice inaudible, but her posture told him everything he needed to know. The slight forward lean, the quick glance back at seats 1A and 1B. The small, tight nod. "You're doing the thing," Naomi said, without looking up from the screen. "What thing?" "The thing where you inspect something that hasn't failed yet." He shifted his eyes back to her, just taking in the cabin. "We are on vacation, Elijah." "I know." "Then let it go." He almost did. 22 years had taught him the discipline of separating the inspector from the husband, and most days the two versions of himself lived together without friction. He was good at compartmentalizing. He had to be. But Patricia Reese came back 8 minutes later carrying a silver tray with 2 champagne flutes, and the way she approached their pod carried a quality Elijah could not file away as coincidence. She moved the way you move toward a situation you have already decided is a problem. "Pre-departure champagne," she said, her voice half a register too high. "That would be lovely, thank you," Naomi answered. Patricia set the glasses down, and her eyes did the slow sweep again. Suit, watch, shoes, the quiet, methodical inventory of someone adding numbers that refused to add up the way she expected them to. "Are you familiar with everything in the cabin?" she asked. The question had a texture to it, smooth on the surface, something rougher underneath. "We are," Elijah said. "Thank you." She didn't move. Her weight shifted forward, barely, an almost involuntary lean. "We sometimes get passengers who are upgraded last minute," she said. "It can be a little overwhelming, all the options. We just want to make sure everyone's comfortable and knows how everything works." The words were correct. The meaning was not. Elijah felt the familiar tightening low in his chest, the one he'd felt in boardrooms, in 5-star restaurants, in 100 rooms across 2 decades, where someone looked at him and quietly decided the math simply didn't work. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was something more insidious than that. The soft, persistent suggestion that his presence in a space required an explanation nobody else at that gate had been asked to provide. He took a slow breath. This was their anniversary. He had promised Naomi 16 days of nothing. "We appreciate that," he said. His voice stayed measured. Polite. "A door that stays closed. We're all set." Patricia's smile thinned to something paper-thin, and she retreated toward the front of the cabin, where she stopped beside a man Elijah hadn't noticed before, mid-50s, silver hair combed, with rigid precision, the posture of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he walked into. The two of them looked back toward seats 1A and 1B. The man's face hardened into something with edges. Naomi lifted her champagne flute, eyes on the window, watching the lights of the airport spread out into the darkness beyond the glass. "We're going to Rome," she said quietly, as if reminding herself. Elijah picked up his own glass. He wanted to believe the rest of the night would simply be the beginning of everything they had planned. But the silver-haired man was already walking toward them, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man delivering good news. His name tag read Richard Vance. He wore his authority the way certain men wear too much cologne, too much of it, in all the wrong places. He stopped at the entrance to their pod, with a smile that arrived a half-second before any warmth did, the kind of practiced expression that lives entirely in the face and never quite makes it to the eyes. "Good evening," he said. "I'm Richard Vance, purser for this flight." He let the title hang in the air a moment. "I just need a moment to verify your seat assignments." Elijah looked at him steadily. "We're in 1A and 1B. "Yes, I can see that." Vance glanced at the boarding passes Elijah held out, then back at his face, in the particular way of a man who has already decided what he's looking for and is simply waiting to confirm it. "There appears to be some discrepancy in our reservation system. We occasionally get passengers rerouted from other flights, and sometimes the seat assignments cross. Fairly common computer issue." Elijah knew airline reservation systems. He'd spent 2 decades reviewing incident reports and operational audits, and he understood exactly how those systems worked and, more importantly, exactly how they failed. They did not produce duplicate seat assignments after the cabin door had been sealed. That particular kind of error got caught at the gate, sometimes at check-in. "Never here. Never now. Our tickets are confirmed," Elijah said. "Booked 2 months ago. Paid in full." "Be that as it may," Vance said, and his voice developed a slight hardness, the kind that surfaces when a man realizes the conversation isn't going where he expected it to. "I'll need to see your purchase confirmation, the actual receipt." Across the aisle, a businessman in 2C lowered his newspaper and watched without any pretense of not watching. Naomi looked up from her screen. She set the entertainment menu down on the tray table and gave Vance her full attention, which was, Elijah knew, an experience most people found far more unsettling than they expected. She had a way of focusing on a person that made them suddenly, uncomfortably aware of exactly how much of their reasoning was showing on their face. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" "Ma'am, I'm simply trying to ensure." "Doctor," she said. A pause, small and deliberate. "Excuse me, doctor." Not sharply, just the way she stated a fact in a clinical setting, without apology and without ever needing to repeat herself after the first correction. "I hold a PhD and a medical degree. The correct form of address is Dr. Turner." Something shifted across Vance's face. Recalculation. Whatever narrative he'd been building in the last several minutes had just acquired a complication he hadn't budgeted for. "Of course," he said. The smile came back, smaller now. "Dr. Turner, I'm simply trying to make sure everyone is in their correctly assigned seat. Standard airline policy." He glanced toward Patricia Reese, who had materialized at his elbow, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been positioned there on purpose. She stood slightly behind him, and to his left, arms loose, and said nothing. Her presence alone was a kind of statement. Elijah held his boarding pass up at chest height, not threatening, not submissive, simply visible. "This is our boarding pass," he said, "scanned and cleared at the gate by your own agent 20 minutes ago. I'm happy to show you that. I am not going to produce a purchase receipt on a boarded aircraft to justify sitting in a seat I have legally occupied." Vance's jaw tightened, fractionally. He had expected the request to produce a small scramble, some rummaging through bags, maybe a flush of embarrassed effort. What he got instead was a flat, clear refusal, delivered without anger and without apology. "Our records indicate a possible issue," Vance said. He was improvising now, and Elijah could hear it. The specificity had drained out of his language entirely, replaced with vague terms that meant nothing and could never be verified. In cases like this, we have to take precautions. What kind of precautions? Naomi asked. Her voice hadn't risen. If anything, it had dropped, which made it land harder. We have to consider the possibility, Vance paused, searching for the right word, and finding only the wrong one, that the documentation may not be entirely in order. Elijah understood exactly what wasn't being said. He'd heard it said in other rooms, in other ways, for most of his adult life. The shape of it never changed. You were somewhere you shouldn't be. You got in, through some error or some deception, and the sooner you accept that and correct it, the easier this goes for everyone. He set his champagne flute down on the tray table. The soft click of glass on polished wood was the only sound that broke the silence. Mr. Vance, Elijah said. His voice dropped into the register he used for formal proceedings, a voice he had never once planned to use on his own anniversary trip. I want to be very clear about something. My wife and I are in our assigned seats. We have presented valid documentation. You have raised an accusation of irregularity without a single piece of evidence and without any basis in your own airline's recorded manifest. That is not a policy enforcement action. That is a very different kind of problem. Vance's face flushed. He straightened his shoulders, the posture of a man mistaking stubbornness for authority. I don't know what game you think you're playing, he said, his voice dropping into something low and ugly, but I've got 26 years with this airline, and I know when something doesn't add up. Patricia Reese finally spoke. We have to protect the integrity of the cabin, she said, with the rehearsed certainty of someone reciting a line she and her colleague had agreed on in the galley 30 seconds earlier. We can't have, she stopped, started again, gate lice. The phrase landed in the air between them and sat there. Elijah looked at Patricia for a long moment. She held his gaze for maybe 2 seconds, then looked away, fixing her eyes on some point just over his left shoulder. He turned back to Vance. You have 2 options, he said. All the warmth had drained out of his voice, replaced by something structural. Load-bearing. The voice of a man who had spent 2 decades making consequential decisions under pressure and understood, precisely, how much weight a sentence could carry. You can return to your duties, and we will address your conduct with your supervisors upon landing. Or you can escalate this. Call the captain, if that's your intention. He paused. But before you make that choice, I want you to understand something. If you escalate this, you are going to set in motion a chain of events that will not bend to your authority, your seniority, or your judgment. You will not be able to stop what follows. It was not a threat. It was a professional assessment delivered by a man who had spent 22 years handing exactly this kind of information to airline executives and chief pilots, with 30,000 flight hours behind them. Vance's expression flickered, just for a second, something that might have been doubt. Then his pride reasserted itself, the way pride does in men, who have been told for a quarter century that they are always right. Is that a threat, Mr. Turner? No, Elijah said quietly. It's a warning. There's a difference, and you're about to learn it the hard way. Vance turned and walked toward the cockpit. 11 minutes later, Captain Daniel Cross arrived at their pod, flanked by Vance and Reese, both wearing the expression of people who believe backup has just arrived to validate them. Cross was younger than Elijah expected for a captain on a wide-body international route, early 50s, close-cropped gray hair, the tightly controlled posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed the moment he opened his mouth. Mr. Turner, Cross said, without offering his hand, I understand there's a ticketing dispute. There is no dispute, Elijah said. There is a documented, confirmed reservation, purchased 2 months ago, and a member of your crew who has decided, without a shred of evidence, that our documentation isn't real. Cross glanced at Vance. Vance nodded, once, like a man confirming a diagnosis. The outcome of that glance was never actually in question. I don't have time to sort out ticketing disputes on the tarmac, Cross said, the phrase coming out smooth, practiced, like something he'd used before. Mr. Vance is responsible for the integrity of the cabin manifest. If he says there's an issue, I have to address it. We have a departure window to maintain. Naomi leaned forward. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular precision of a woman delivering a finding that was not open for negotiation. Captain, are you telling us that you are declining to review our documentation and choosing instead to accept an unverified claim from your crew as fact? Cross's professional pleasantness thinned at the edges. What I'm saying, ma'am, is that this discussion has run its course. The safety and security of this flight are my primary concern, and I am not going to have a disruptive situation in the cabin before we even push back. We are not being disruptive, Elijah said, very quietly. We are sitting in our seats, responding to harassment. That's a matter of perspective, Cross said. He crossed his arms. My crew feels threatened. Elijah had been in enough rooms with airline executives to recognize that specific rhetorical maneuver on contact. Take the behavior of the person doing the harassing, reassign it onto the person being harassed, and use it as justification for whatever action has already been decided upon. It was not an argument. It was a conclusion dressed up as an observation, and you could not counter it with facts, because facts had never been the material it was built from. I'm going to have to ask you both to deplane, Cross said, his tone dropping into finality. You can resolve this with the gate agents. If your ticketing checks out, we'll get you on the next available flight. Somewhere behind them, someone drew a breath and held it. A young woman 2 rows back made a small sound, not quite a word. The businessman across the aisle went very still. Elijah did not move. Captain Cross, he said. The authority in his voice was not performed. It was native, the way certain frequencies belong to certain instruments and no others. I want you to confirm something for me, because I want to be precise about what's happening here. You are invoking your captain's authority under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3 to remove 2 ticketed passengers from this aircraft. You are doing so based on unverified claims from your crew without reviewing a single piece of documentation under the stated justification of a disruptive situation that does not exist. Is that an accurate description of what you are doing? Cross paused. The specificity of the question, the precise regulatory citation, the complete absence of emotion in the man asking it, introduced something into the air that hadn't been there a moment before. He'd expected anger. He'd expected protest, maybe tears, maybe the practiced apology of people caught somewhere they weren't supposed to be. He had not expected this. But Captain Daniel Cross had also spent 25 years being told he was right about things, and the momentum of that history was stronger than the pause. That's correct, he said. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or do I need to call airport security? Elijah turned and looked at Naomi. She met his eyes, her face composed in the particular way a face composes itself, when the person wearing it has already made a decision she will not revisit. There was pain in it, real, unguarded pain, the pain of being judged for exactly what she was not. But underneath that pain sat something unyielding. Bedrock. She gave him a single, barely visible nod. This fight was over. The one that mattered was about to begin. Elijah stood, slowly, with the kind of deliberate unhurriedness that communicates not surrender, but documentation. He lifted his carry-on from the overhead bin. Naomi stood beside him and retrieved her bag, her movements matching his, coordinated, unhurried, the movements of 2 people who understood that every gesture they made in the next 60 seconds would be watched and remembered. Every eye in the first-class cabin followed them. Elijah could feel the weight of those gazes the way you feel weather changing. Some of it was sympathy, some of it was discomfort. Some of it was the specific unease of witnesses who know they are watching something wrong happen and have decided, quietly, that the cost of saying so out loud is too high for them tonight. No one spoke. The young woman 2 rows back looked at Naomi with an expression that said everything she couldn't bring herself to say. Naomi held her gaze for exactly 1 second and gave her the smallest possible nod. An acknowledgement passed between 2 strangers and gone. Richard Vance and Patricia Reese had positioned themselves near the galley. Vance had the faint inflation of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. Reese's expression was harder to read, or would have been, to anyone who hadn't spent 2 decades studying what people's faces do when they believe, right down to the bone, that they are the ones in the right. Elijah looked at each of them as he passed, carefully, completely, the way a man looks at something he is committing to memory for official purposes. The walk from seat 1A to the aircraft door was maybe 30 feet. Elijah would never be able to explain afterward why it felt so much longer than that. Maybe because every step was measured. Every step was, in some sense, logged. The cabin door opened. Jet bridge air hit them, cool and sharp. They stepped through, and the door closed behind them, with a sound that was final in a way few sounds ever managed to be. They stood on the bridge alone. Fluorescent light, harsh and flat. Below them, through the gap between bridge and fuselage, the dark tarmac and the distant lights of the runway. Their seats sat empty behind that closed door. The anniversary trip to Rome was, for the moment, over. Naomi exhaled slowly. Not a sigh, something steadier than that. She reached out and took Elijah's hand. Okay, she said. It wasn't defeat. It was orientation. I know where we are. And I know exactly where we go from here. Elijah squeezed her hand once, and they walked back up the jet bridge toward the terminal. With every step, the calculation in his mind sharpened, grew more precise, more certain. The anger was there, real, legitimate, and he wasn't pretending it wasn't. But anger was a tool, and right now he had a different tool to pick up. He had a phone. He had a badge number. He had 22 years of knowing exactly which extension to dial and exactly what to say the moment someone answered. And he had a flawless, unbroken memory of every word, every gesture, every violation he had just watched happen in real time. The gate area at C-22 was mostly empty by the time they emerged. The last major departure had cleared 20 minutes earlier, and the corridor had that hollow, particular quiet of a space that had recently held a crowd and was now finished with it. A few travelers with early connections slept across rows of chairs, arms folded over their backs. The gate agent looked up as Elijah and Naomi came through the jet bridge doors. Young man, early 30s, the expression of someone whose shift had just produced something he had not expected and was already unhappy about. The flight's closed, he said. What happened? Before either of them could answer, his phone rang. He listened. His eyes moved to Elijah, then to Naomi, then back down to his screen, with the particular pallor of a man realizing, in real time, that his evening had just gotten considerably worse. Elijah didn't wait for him to finish the call. He pulled out his own phone, scrolled to a contact saved simply as Regional Duty Officer and pressed call. It picked up on the second ring. FAA Regional Operations, this is Inspector Delgado. Delgado, it's Turner. Senior Air Carrier Safety. I need you to open an incident file right now, tonight, before this airline has a chance to touch a single record. I want cabin crew logs, cockpit voice recorder preservation notice, gate manifest, and boarding footage from Terminal C, Gate 22, locked down within the hour. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a man who has just heard a name he recognizes say something he did not expect to hear on a Friday night. Inspector Turner, are you a passenger on this flight? I was, Elijah said. My wife and I were removed from seats 1A and 1B roughly 6 minutes ago on the unverified claim of a purser named Richard Vance, ratified without review by Captain Daniel Cross, under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3. I am invoking my authority as a Federal Aviation Safety Officer to preserve every record connected to this incident, effective immediately. Copy that, sir. Opening the file now. I want a notice to preserve sent to the airline's legal department tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Tonight. Understood, Inspector. He hung up. Naomi was watching him, with an expression he had seen only a handful of times across 18 years, something between grief and steel, a woman who has just watched an old wound reopen and is already calculating how to make sure it heals correctly this time. They're going to try to bury this, she said quietly. Explain it away. A misunderstanding. An overzealous crew member. They can try, Elijah said. But there were 11 other passengers in that cabin who watched the whole thing happen, and at least 3 of them had their phones out. He was right about that, though he wouldn't learn the full shape of it until the following week. The private airline lounge they were escorted to an hour later, after a supervisor, pale and stammering apologies that arrived far too late to mean anything, discovered exactly who he had just watched get removed from a flight, smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Naomi sat across from Elijah at a small round table, a legal pad in front of her, already writing. She wrote the way she always did in a crisis, fast, precise, dating every entry, time-stamping every observation, while it was still fresh enough to be useful in a courtroom. "Read it back to me," Elijah said. She did. Every word Vance had said. Every word Reese had said. The exact phrase, gate lice, and the exact number of seconds Reese had held his gaze before looking away. Naomi Turner had spent her career studying how memory degrades under stress, which was precisely why she never trusted her own memory to hold anything longer than it had to. She wrote it all down before her mind could start smoothing the edges the way memory always tries to. At 11:40 that night, a man in an expensive suit and an even more expensive haircut arrived at the lounge, introducing himself as the airline's regional vice president of customer relations, a man named Gregory Chastain. He offered vouchers. He offered an upgrade on their rebooked flight. He offered, with visible discomfort, an apology that used the word misunderstanding 3 times in one sentence. Naomi looked up from her legal pad. "Mr. Chastain," she said, "would you like to know what Mr. Vance said to us, or would you prefer I just accept your vouchers and let your legal department handle the rest tomorrow?" Chastain's smile faltered. "Ma'am, I assure you, this is being taken extremely seriously." "It's Doctor," she said, without looking up. "And no, not yet. It isn't." The formal investigation opened the following Monday, and it did not move the way Richard Vance and Patricia Reese assumed federal investigations moved, slowly, quietly, easy to smooth, over with a well-worded internal memo. Elijah recused himself from directly leading it. The conflict of interest was obvious, and he wasn't going to hand the airline's lawyers a single procedural gift, but he made sure the file landed on the desk of an investigator who did not owe anyone in that industry a favor. Over the following 6 weeks, 7 passengers came forward. A businessman named Harold Prentice, the man from 2C, who had lowered his newspaper and watched the whole thing happen, gave a statement so detailed it included the exact wording of Vance's demand for a purchase receipt. A young graduate student named Camille Okafor, the woman who had been seated 2 rows behind the Turners, the one who had made the small sound she couldn't quite turn into a word, submitted 9 pages of testimony describing not just what she'd seen that night, but a pattern she said she'd witnessed on 2 previous flights with the same purser. The cockpit voice recorder, preserved before it could be overwritten, captured Captain Cross's exchange with Vance almost word for word, including a moment, 30 seconds before Cross ever approached the Turner's seats, where Vance told him flatly, "We've got 2 in first class who don't look like they belong there, and Reese thinks it's a fraud situation." Cross's reply, recorded and unerasable, was a single word: handle it. That recording ended any conversation about misunderstandings. Patricia Reese was placed on administrative leave within a week and terminated within a month, once the internal review confirmed what Elijah had suspected from the first 30 seconds of watching her face at the boarding door, that this was not her first time deciding, on sight and without cause, that a passenger's ticket couldn't possibly be real. Richard Vance fought it. He hired a lawyer. He gave interviews to a regional news outlet insisting he had only been following protocol, that he'd had a legitimate concern about ticketing irregularities, that the airline was scapegoating him to protect its public image. He said this on camera 3 days before the cockpit recording was entered into the federal record and played, in full, at a Department of Transportation hearing that several journalists happened to attend. He did not fight it after that. Captain Daniel Cross lost his certificate to command a flight for 18 months, pending remedial training and a full psychological and bias competency evaluation, a suspension the FAA's own hearing officer noted was lenient only because Cross had, in the end, told the truth under oath rather than continuing to deny what the recording had already proven. He did not fly again for the airline. that had employed him for 25 years. When the story broke publicly, his name appeared in 3 national papers beside the words Captain's Authority and Unverified Allegations, and it stayed there. The airline itself did not escape, with an apology and a fruit basket. The Department of Transportation opened a civil rights inquiry that ran in parallel with the FAA's operational review, and by the time both concluded, the airline had signed a 44-page consent decree, a complete rebuild of crew training around implicit bias and passenger verification procedures, an independent oversight committee with subpoena power over future complaints, a no-fault reporting mechanism for any employee who witnessed discriminatory treatment and feared retaliation for reporting it, and a civil penalty just north of $3 million, payable not to the airline's shareholders' relief fund, but to a newly created passenger rights office within the FAA itself. At the public hearing, where the consent decree was formally announced, a reporter asked Vance, cornered outside the building, whether he had anything to say to the Turners. He stood there a long moment, the cameras rolling, his lawyer visibly wishing he would say nothing at all. "I was wrong," he said finally. His voice cracked slightly on the second word. "I looked at 2 people, and I decided something about them, before they'd said a single word to me, and I was wrong, and it cost me everything I spent 26 years building. I don't know how to undo that. I just know I'll never do it again." It was an absolution. Nobody in that room, least of all Elijah, watching the clip later, that night on his laptop, mistook it for absolution. But it was, Naomi said quietly, when he showed her the footage, the first true thing Richard Vance had said since the moment he'd walked up to their pod, with a clipboard and a decision already made. 16 days later than planned, but exactly on schedule for a very different kind of arrival, Elijah and Naomi Turner landed in Rome on a clear, cold morning, in seats they had booked themselves, on an airline that had called them personally to confirm, twice, that everything about their reservation was correct before they ever stepped foot in the terminal. Rome in late autumn wasn't the Rome of postcards. The light came in low and gold through a thin haze, turning the old stone the color of warm honey. The Tiber ran quieter than it did in summer. The cafes kept their outdoor chairs stacked against the possibility of rain, and the whole city felt less like a performance and more like something private, something that had been living its life long before either of them arrived, and would go on living it long after they left. They stayed in a small apartment above a bakery in Trastevere that a colleague of Naomi's had found for them, creaky stairs, a kitchen window that looked out over a courtyard where an old bicycle leaned against a wall and never seemed to move. It smelled like flour and old stone and coffee. It was nothing like a hotel. It was exactly right. They walked mornings along the river. They ate in restaurants where no one spoke English, and the menus were handwritten in a hand that had clearly been writing the same menu for 30 years. They sat in parks in the pale afternoon light and read their separate books and said very little, the way you do when the silence between 2 people has stopped needing to be filled. On the 5th day, it rained, and they stayed inside with coffee and worked their way through an Italian crossword that took them nearly 3 hours because their Italian was good enough to be overconfident and not quite good enough to be fast. They argued cheerfully over one clue for 20 straight minutes. Elijah was wrong. He conceded gracefully. It was, he realized somewhere in the middle of that argument, the most at peace he had felt since the night at Gate C-22. He did not stop being an FAA inspector for 16 days. He wouldn't have known how. He noticed the safety card in the seat pocket of the regional flight they took to visit a friend of Naomi's outside Florence. He noticed a maintenance access panel on a taxi at the airport that had been improperly reattached. He couldn't make the observation stop occurring. What he could do was set them back down again, gently, and return to being a man in Rome, with his wife, which he did, every time, a little more easily than the time before. Naomi worked on a research paper in the early mornings, before he woke, sitting at the kitchen table with the courtyard view. It was a paper on authority validation and cognitive bias in customer-facing safety roles, the one she had been trying and failing to get funded for 3 years. It now had a case study specific enough to anchor the entire argument. She did not tell the journal's editor that the case study was her own life. The argument, she decided, would stand better on the data alone. She submitted the final draft on the morning of their 14th day. That evening they walked along the river to a restaurant Elijah had found in a guidebook printed a decade earlier, which meant it was either still wonderful or long since closed, and found it was still wonderful. The waiter brought a small plate of pastries they hadn't ordered, said only that it was from the kitchen, and refused to explain further. It was that kind of restaurant. Walking back along the river afterward, Naomi stopped on a bridge and looked out at the reflection of the city lights breaking apart and reforming on the water. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if we hadn't had it? If we'd just been Elijah and Naomi, no badge, no title, no authority to make a captain reconsider a decision he'd already made?" Elijah stood beside her and looked at the same water. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The river moved beneath them, indifferent and patient, the way rivers always are. "I think about the people who are exactly us," she said, "without the badge. Who have the same right to be wherever they are, and no mechanism to force the system to recognize it. I know the training helps. I know the fine helps. I know the oversight committee helps. It's not enough," he said. "But it's more than there was before." She turned her head and looked at him. "Is that enough?" He thought about the 44-page consent decree, the retrained crews, the 3 careers that had ended, the oversight committee, with real teeth, the reporting mechanism built specifically, so the next Camille Okafor wouldn't have to wonder whether speaking up would cost her something. He thought about a system that was slow, imperfect, and structurally resistant to the kind of change one incident could ever fully accomplish on its own. He thought about the gap between what had been done and what still needed doing. "It's enough to be worth doing," he said. "It's not enough to be finished." She turned back to the river. After a while, she said, "Thank you for planning this trip." He looked at her. Her face in the Roman evening light was quiet, in the particular way of someone who has already decided what things are worth and keeps that knowledge somewhere private, somewhere it won't wear thin from use. "Happy anniversary," he said. 16 days late, and exactly on time. She smiled, not the composed, careful smile she wore in conference rooms and hearings, but the other one. The one from the terminal, weeks ago, that had cut straight through the noise and landed somewhere behind his ribs. He held on to it the whole walk home. On their last morning, Elijah stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked down at the courtyard. The bicycle was there, as always. Somewhere above the rooftops, a church bell marked the hour, with the patience of something that had been marking time for centuries and had no intention of stopping now. He thought about Camille Okafor, who had given 9 pages of testimony that helped strip a captain of his certificate. He thought about Harold Prentice, silent on the aircraft, who had called the FAA the moment he landed and stayed on the phone for 40 minutes. He thought about the gate agent, who had torn a boarding pass in half without a second thought and never once considered that the woman holding the other half held a doctorate that made her more qualified to question airline safety protocol than most of the executives who ran it. He thought about all the moments, that night where something different could have happened, where one person saying something out loud, or looking a little more carefully, or pausing half a second before acting on an instinct they'd never once examined, would have changed everything. He finished his coffee, set the cup down. He and Naomi had a flight to catch. They left the keys in the lockbox and rolled their suitcases down the creaking stairs one last time. A taxi carried them to the airport, where the terminal was already alive, with the particular energy of morning departures, all the small beginnings airports traffic in, every single day, whether anyone notices or not. Elijah checked the pressure indicator on the aircraft door out of habit as they boarded, confirmed it was correct, and said nothing about it to anyone. The aircraft lifted off the runway into a clear, cold Roman morning, climbing into winter blue sky. Below them the city arranged itself into its familiar shape, the river threading through stone, the monuments they hadn't visited still visible even from altitude, before it shrank into an abstraction and disappeared beneath a thin layer of cloud. Naomi had her book. Elijah had the window. The flight was full, smooth, and unremarkable in every way that mattered. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Wherever you are, whatever brought you to this story, consider the next time you find yourself standing at the edge of an automatic assumption. The next time certainty arrives in your chest before a single piece of evidence has. The next time someone's simple presence in a room seems, for reasons you haven't examined, to require an explanation their presence alone should never require. That pause, that half second between instinct and action, that is where everything actually lives. Not the drama of the investigation, not the satisfaction of the reckoning. The ordinary, private moment where a person decides whether to look a little more carefully or a little less. The sky at altitude belongs equally to everyone who has earned a seat in it.